The video you're about to watch is part of a collaborative series between myself and other channels aimed at exploring misconceptions, common or perhaps not so common, held about past events, what really happened, and why they matter. This video will be tackling the famous, or perhaps infamous, Cura Annonae, the grain dole of ancient Rome, with the caveat that, due to disparities in evidence, the period being tackled is strictly limited to the Late Republic, as well as the additional issue of an apparent political split in the Late Republic between optimates and populares. Unlike the other channels in this collaboration, mine often deals with ancient history, or at the very least classical, which means that any and all topics covered from that period come with their own unique set of problems. So with that in mind, this video will be broken into 3 parts. Why the grain dole matters in the context of the modern world, what the issues are surrounding the understanding of the grain dole, and last but not least, what this system really was and how it functioned. Broadly speaking, Roman history is broken up into 3 periods, which are at one and the same time distinct and which also overlap. After the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the eastern half of the state continued into its medieval period, sometimes referred to as the Byzantine Empire. None of these dates are concrete, and historians have altered their chronologies as they develop arguments about what actually happened to the Roman Empire and why, based on the evidence available, especially the material evidence, and it's now fairly current among professionals to argue that genuine Roman collapse and a mental shift to living in a world that was decidedly not Roman happened not in 476 as a distinct event, but spanned roughly 450 to about 530 as a process. The same sort of thing applies to the Republic. Should Pompey the Great be considered the first emperor, or perhaps a proto-emperor? Did the Republic go through multiple phases of collapse, or just rapid change until historians understand what they're looking at to be the empire? No matter what your particular argument is about these events, the one thing everybody agrees on is that at some point the Republic, and then the Empire, came to an end and they never came back. Dozens of states, from Bismarck's Germany to Charlemagne's Frankish Empire to Mussolini's Italy to the modern United States, have either claimed aspects of the legacy of Rome or have claimed to be the successor to Rome outright. This of course leads each of these states to the same problem. The Romans disappeared one day, and if these states weren't careful, the same thing could happen to them. This is where the grain dole comes into play. Everybody watching this has probably heard the phrase bread and circuses at some point in connection with Roman history. It originates with Juvenal, a late 1st century Roman poet who composed a collection of satirical poems entitled Satires, and this particular phrase comes from the 10th piece. This, in part, is a reference to the Roman practice of the distribution of wheat to citizens, and it has evolved over the centuries into something of a popular idea for the decline first of the Roman Republic, and then the Roman Empire. It will usually take different forms depending on who you're reading or what you're listening to, but usually the argument goes something like this. A series of politicians, starting with Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, attempted to address severe economic inequality. Part of that attempt involved the mass cancellation of debts, the reallocation of tax burdens, and the establishment of the grain dole as a form of welfare for Roman citizens, particularly the poor. Eventually, the receipt of that welfare made the bulk of the population complacent. That complacency, combined with the newfound burdens of a Mediterranean empire, caused economic problems in the Republic, and it enabled strongmen like Pompey, Caesar, and eventually Octavian to push aside republican institutions and establish a monarchy in all but name, because the citizens did not care as long as the proverbial bread and circuses continued to be provided. Therefore, this sort of thing can be dangerous for any sort of democratic government. Because so many modern states, if not much of Western civilization, however you choose to define that, looks to a collective Roman past, there is nothing inherently wrong with using Roman history to make arguments for modern social policy, or for aiding political discussion, but the lessons drawn from that history have to be grounded in the reality of the past. The Roman grain dole was not a system of welfare, and it makes little to no sense to view it as such. That is the misconception being tackled in this video. So if that's the case, then what was this, and why was it implemented? The short answer to that question is that it was designed to basically prevent famine from happening in the city of Rome. Analyzing how this system developed and how it worked, however, leads us to 2 serious problems. The first concerns the actual source material historians have access to for studying the grain dole, and the second concerns what historians of the Roman Republic usually term the new politics. In an ideal situation, we would have all of the material for a given topic or period available. So, as an analogy, let's say that having all the material would put our knowledge at 10 out of 10. In other words, our information on a given period is total and the archives are complete. The period being examined in this video, the Late Republic between about 120 BC and about 44 BC, starts out at maybe a 5 out of 10 in terms of the availability of sources. We have enough to construct a general picture of what was going on, but there are going to be different ways to structure chronologies, which is going to impact how events are understood. For the intervening 80 years or so, the availability of sources drops from a 5 out of 10 and proceeds to fluctuate between a 3 or even a 2, and then it jumps back to a 5 at the very end. This is a major point about working with the ancient past. After a certain point, we have to be comfortable with 6 words. Sometimes we just do not know. So when talking about the grain dole, we have to recognize that we do not have all the information available on it that we would like. That's the first issue. The second issue concerns the new politics. So what is this and why does it matter? The decades spanning 133 BC to 44 BC, marked by the murder of Tiberius Gracchus and the assassination of Julius Caesar respectively, are generally termed the crisis of the Roman Republic. It's a period marked by an increase in political violence, 3 destructive wars on Italian soil, and the rise of concentrated political power. Tiberius attempted to institute a land reform bill, but the fallout from it resulted not only in his death, but it also helped spark a debate over who should really be leading the state. This division was crystallized in the writings of the lawyer and politician Cicero, who referred to this division as being one between the best men, or optimates, and the supporters of the people, or populares. Although Cicero does use the term parties to refer to the optimates and populares, in the context of the Late Republic, it does not refer to the establishment of political parties in the sense of groups with defined platforms, or that coordinated candidates with a general vision in mind, such as the Republicans and Democrats in the contemporary US, so much as it refers to an approach to conducting Roman politics. As historian Catherine Steele points out, the dominant features of this form of political action, which can be described as popularis, were legislation offering material benefit to the people as a whole, in direct popular action, particularly over matters which were normally dealt with by the Senate. It provoked violent repression, on occasion, from the Senate and magistrates. Popularis described a technique of political action and a belief about the practical location of authority. It was not a party or even a faction, though popularis tribunes were aware of their predecessors and planned their actions accordingly. The approach taken by a popularis politician primarily consisted in turning their back on political tradition, often literally. They often turned towards the crowd, placing their backs to the Senate House and addressing the Roman population directly, and otherwise utilizing the power of the crowd and speeches addressed to them, often to augment their own political ambitions. The degree to which popularis politicians actually believed what they were saying, or whether they were utilizing these methods for their own personal gain, is still a heavily debated question among professional historians. Much of it, though, is tied up in a related debate over how the benefits of a newly won empire should be shared with people who legally were Roman citizens, compared to those who were not. This is often what's meant by new politics in the historiography of the Roman Republic, and it matters for this video because the grain dole was introduced by a politician who used popularis methods, the brother of Tiberius, Gaius Gracchus. So with all of this covered, let's talk about the grain dole, to the extent that we even can, anyway. Gaius Gracchus was elected tribune for 123, a position he held again in 122, and during this time he introduced legislation to establish a system of grain distribution. So why was this done? Well, despite what gets thrown around in both modern political rhetoric and in rhetoric during the Roman period, this was not, and was never intended, to be a system akin to welfare or some sort of a handout. The Romans were extremely clear about this because they emphasized that the system was not free distribution. There are actually better policies for making comparisons to welfare, but the grain system is not one of them. During the time of Gaius Gracchus, the city of Rome had an estimated population of between about 250,000 and 300,000 people, with a significant portion of those people coming and going constantly as fortunes in the countryside fluctuated. So to feed this massive city, thousands of ships transporting grain and other essentials traveled to Rome constantly, but it was not always consistent, and there was always the risk of a shortage, especially if there was a failed harvest. There already existed several warehouses to store food in the city, but the introduction of this bill, known as the Lex Impronia Frumentaria, was done with the intent to prevent famine in what was Italy's largest city. Rather than being a system to hand out free grain, it was designed to subsidize a certain amount of grain at state expense, and it applied equally to all citizens, not just one segment of the population. The roots of this system appear to be connected with the military, because campaigns overseas required that grain be obtained to feed the army, which meant that some other system was needed to feed Rome itself. Politicians were responsible for overseeing this, so it's that connection which first got the state involved in ensuring that the city basically did not starve. The problem with saying anything more in concrete terms, though, is that our evidence begins to fluctuate and the grain laws go through several different forms and the specifics of them do change. Gaius's initial law enabled all male citizens in Rome, starting at either age 11 or at age 14, to obtain subsidized grain. Sulla does actually abolish the system, but it was quickly reinstated and it's not clear how much grain was subsidized, but a new law in 73 BC established the amount at roughly 33 kilograms of grain per month per family head. This was enough to keep a family alive essentially, but not completely full, and it's likely that further grain would have been obtained on the private market, which is a major part of why discussion surrounding the Roman economy has shifted the emphasis from being something like a command economy in full to state-directed industries that were grafted onto a broader system based around markets, banks, loans, and contracts, which the Roman state did not really interfere with. It quickly became a key feature of Popularis Politics, and arguments were had not over the principle of subsidized grain, but rather over the cost. This is best seen in 58 BC, when the Tribune Clodius introduced a bill to actually make this free, known as the Lex Clodia, and it was free for a short time, offset by the wealth of newly acquired Cyprus, but it sparked a huge amount of controversy because it was feared that literal free grain would bankrupt the state. So that would be the biggest misconception being tackled in this portion of the video. The grain dole was designed to help prevent famine in the city, and it was subsidized, not an outright handout, although that was tried at one point with Clodius. Everything else associated with that system, though, is much more difficult to discuss. How did the grain get to the city? How was it stored? How was it distributed, and who got it? We know very little about all of this. It might be easier to cover what definitely did not exist during the Republic. The majority of the grain obtained to feed one's family came from the private side of the market, and we know that Augustus, the first emperor, specifically made it a point to restrict speculation and to avoid the development of an ancient equivalent of a futures market in grain, essentially attempting to ensure that price fluctuations did not affect the market, because in 58 BC, the distribution of free grain, possibly stemming from bad harvests, but also possibly worsened by speculation and by hoarding, appears to have seriously rocked Italy's economy. Regulations like that did not exist during the Late Republic. Cicero, one of our main sources for this period, mentions grain provinces which referred to Sicily, Sardinia, and Africa. In both Sicily and Sardinia, there was a tithe placed on the first tenth of the grain harvest, put in place during the Second Punic War, with the tithe placed on the next tenth of the harvest established by law following that war. So from these two islands, Rome was supplied by about 20% of the grain cultivated there, and eventually during the imperial period, grain from Egypt was also imported. Once the city itself got the amount required, the remaining grain could be sold to allies as a mark of favored political status because what they were buying was considered imperial grain. So how was all of this grain stored and then distributed? The answer to that question is both specific and vague depending on how you view it. We do know that prior to the institution of the grain laws, there were large warehouses to store grain and other foodstuffs in the city, and we know that after the institution of those laws, more warehouses were built. That is about it. While there was an office created to oversee the whole thing, known as the Praefectus Annonae, who was drawn from equestrian rank, that was instituted at the end of the period examined in this video, and it's with that we come back to Popularis Politics. The traditional way that Roman social structures are usually thought about breaks these structures down into three categories: patricians, equestrians, and then plebeians. This system is not incorrect, but by the time of the Late Republic, it essentially no longer applied. Originally, the system was broken into patricians, plebeians, and those who were enslaved. with the patricians stemming, at least traditionally, from the first 100 senators who were appointed by Romulus, while the plebeians were descended from everybody else. An alternative explanation is that the patricians were descended from the original founders of Rome, while the plebeians were drawn from immigrants who came to Rome after its founding. But really, this is so shrouded in the mist of time that it would not be surprising if the answer was somewhere in the middle. The acquisition of an empire and the vast wealth that was drawn from it eventually caused a portion of the plebeians and the patricians, known as the equites, from which we get the term equestrian, because they were able to own and maintain horses, to emerge as a distinct group that had to be recognized legally. By the time covered in this video, the equites had become large enough and wealthy enough that they actually dwarfed the patricians and they were granted similar legal rights. This moved a new group of people, drawn from both the patricians and the equites, to the top of the social pyramid. This group was known as the nobility, or the people who were well known. People who were able to essentially claim a consul, Rome's highest political office, as an ancestor, and who were able to stand for higher level offices. It's at this point that we can start to talk about a Roman aristocracy in the proper sense, the nobility, and everybody else, drawn socially from the legal categories of patrician, equestrian, and plebeian. Because the equestrians had at this point gained not only in legal rights but also in sheer population size, more often than not it was the equestrians, not the plebeians and the common people, who were at the center of Popularis agitation. Prior to that, there does seem to have been some sort of government organization, but there also seems to have been a desire to hand over this power to a general. It's not clear if the grain was distributed on a weekly basis, and it's not clear if it was distributed from the warehouses where the lowered price was collected, or if it was actually brought to a market. All we know for certain is that it was sold at a reduced price somehow, and no historian has offered a model for how this was done that has convinced everybody else. Probably the most important question here is who actually got this grain? Well, much like everything else on this topic, we know some things for certain, and for some other things we have educated guesses. Beginning with the passage of Gaius Gracchus' law, it applied to all male Roman citizens in the city, no matter how wealthy or poor they were. Who was able to obtain that subsidized grain appears to have fluctuated between about 122 BC and about 58 BC, when the passage of the Lex Clodia made it free because the next year, in 57 BC, the general Pompey was given legal rights to essentially cut back on the grain and officially compiled a list of about 320,000 male citizens who were eligible. He was also granted a sum of about 40 million sesterces to purchase large amounts of grain to fix what had become a shortage. We're not very clear on the specifics here, but Pompey, and then Caesar, who cut that list in half to about 150,000, appears to have done this at least in part because there was some sort of issue regarding fraud. Wealthy Romans were freeing slaves, granting them citizenship, and then having those slaves give their former masters the subsidized grain they had collected, which the masters then sold on the market for jacked up prices. It's not certain how big of an issue this was, but it appears to have been serious enough that the benefits had to be partially curbed. This is, in broad strokes, what we know about this system as it existed in the Late Republic. Pompey and then Caesar became viewed as the guarantors of a stable, relatively cheap supply of grain, which would supplement other available foodstuffs, and it was during a riot caused by the price of grain in 22 BC that Augustus was encouraged by the rioters to take official control of this policy. From that point onward, things were still shaky and there were still issues to iron out, until at some point between 8 and 14 AD, the office of Praefectus Annonae was instituted to officially oversee the whole enterprise. It is with that measure that the grain dole reached its mature form and fully became not a social measure, but gratuities for a privileged social group, meaning, of course, Roman citizens, who no longer needed to worry about the possibility of famine in the city of Rome. The imperial capital, finally, had a system able to sustain it.